Hello and welcome. This is Beyond Business, the program where we look at the latest trends in the global economy. And among those trends, there's one that hasn't gone unnoticed in this part of the world. France is being overshadowed in a field that's always been part of the national pride here, the winemaking business, or more specifically, education in wine and spirits. An increasing number of professionals who will shape the market in the coming years are now being trained in Britain. France 24's Margot Duquesne has visited the world's largest wine school in London. Let's watch her report and we'll be right back.
Wine glass in hand, the teacher addresses the class. Here, students are learning about subtle taste differences in wines, as well as their origins and production methods. The school's not located in Bordeaux or Burgundy. It's in the UK, not a country known for its wine production. Yet London's Wine and Spirit Education Trust, or WSET, is one of the best-known and most prestigious wine schools in the world. Founded in 1969, the institute has built up a reputation for offering quality oenology courses. 80% of its graduates go on to work in the wine industry. The English school has become a leader in its field.
What we have to do now is smell, taste, and then briefly give a conclusion on each of the two wines. So,
Michael Buriak's been giving wine tasting courses at the school for 23 years. Maps and posters of Burgundy and Bordeaux decorate the walls of the classroom, but today's tasting session focuses on wines from the New World, vintages from Australia and New Zealand.
Nowadays, New World has really had a dominant feature in the UK, especially. That's not to say France or Italy or Spain doesn't have its role to play. It does, certainly. But there's always a fight to kind of get wines into our market, and it's a choice that we make. But on our courses, we show everything across the world. So we don't, we're not selective. We show everything across the world.
Students learn about trends in the wine market, although teachers try to avoid giving preference to particular countries or regions. In the 1990s, the school started to expand. Today, it offers courses in 55 countries. A surprising development, given that Britain is by no means a major player in the wine industry.
We are impartial, so we're not here to promote a particular country's wines.
Impartiality that doesn't exclude certain recommendations. For example, one of their textbooks says, New Zealand shows the greatest promise as a source of Pinot Noir wines to rival the best from Burgundy.
We don't judge whether wines are good or bad. Mm-hmm. We have within our courses a list of wines which the student need to taste, but we don't. It's not up to us to say that this wine is better than that wine. What we are looking to show our students is a typical Chablis, a typical Chardonnay, a typical Gewürztraminer, etc. We don't have a classement, as you say, of wines.
A principle that's been taken on board by the school's alumni. Charlotte studied oenology at the WSET and now works as a sommelier in one of London's best restaurants.
So, the wine list is quite extensive. We have about 750 wines on the list. It's updated every week.
Charlotte explains what she feels is important when selecting a wine for a customer.
I check with the maitre d' what they have ordered to eat first, and then I like to find out from them what style of wine they generally enjoy. So I think that's more important than matching it to the foods.
Charlotte is one of more than 27,500 people who got their qualification from the WSET. Many of them work in the wine industry around the world, transmitting their knowledge and passion for wine to thousands of others.
I'd love to be one of them, wouldn't you? Well, for more on this, we're now joined by journalist and wine expert David Cobble. Thank you very much for speaking to us today on France 24.
Hello.
Britain is not particularly famous for its wine production. There's this report, and the success of this school shows that you don't need to be to make wine in order to teach wine.
No. Well, for example, I teach wine and I don't make wine, so there you have the illustration. I think the success of this is very clearly due to the fact, first of all, that Britain can be impartial because it's not engaged in trying to sell wine. To give you an idea, the English vineyard is 1,000 hectares, so it's absolutely negligible. France has something like 900,000 hectares. So The origin, you have to understand the origin of the Wine and Spirit Education Trust. It's an organization from all the importers and distributors in the initial stages when the wine market was beginning to develop in the 50s and the 60s after the war. They felt that they had to have an increased level of professionalism amongst the people who were selling wine, whether on the retail or the wholesale level. So they got together and set up a training scheme.
Was it meant specifically for the British market initially?
It meant initially for the British market, for the British trade, in fact, not for private individuals, but for tradespeople, people who were manning shops or supermarkets or restaurants, or who were salespeople travelling the road to sell to those shops. All the trade could come in, and the trade got together to put up the cursus. And the cursus was because England has always been a big importing market, not producing any wine. Since the Middle Ages, England has imported wine from France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Portugal. Port was created for the British market. Sparkling champagne was created for the British market. In fact, one could even say in the English market, because at that time the French only drank still champagne. So there's that tradition of looking after the products, of getting information about them, and they structure themselves to be able to train the future salespeople who would enable the market to grow, so that a private consumer could get reliable information about the products he was buying. That explains why the Wine and Spirit Education Trust scheme got up and going, and once it had trained to a high level of qualification most of the English professionals working, it then started to move out to train English-speaking countries. For example, Hong Kong, Singapore, that naturally moved into China, into Japan, and now it has opened in France as well, in French.
So what you're saying is that because Britain and the city of London, for that matter, had to import so much wine, that's the reason why they had to be unbiased. There's no bias. That's the recipe for success.
Yes, there's two aspects. I think the reason for success is unbiasedness, undisputably. They had no axe to grind. They had no particular reason to favour one wine or another. And as the gentleman showed in the film, they are not biased. They will sell a wine if it's good. And as a training, if you're training somebody, you should not introduce bias into the training. You should introduce facts. You should introduce an analytical approach to enable people to make up their own minds. Personal preferences, we all have them, and we will always have them. That's not a way to teach, to give somebody your personal preferences.
How is this going to affect the market? Do you think that this new generation of professionals coming out of this school will eventually affect the consumer's tastes and shape up the market in the next few years by opening up the market to other countries around the world where you have also wine growers and producers?
I think it already has done. You can see it in the English market, where the share of France used to dominate the English market. Its share has now dropped to below 30%. All wines now have a chance. It's a very competitive market, but then most world markets are competitive. Belgium is very competitive. Germany is very competitive. All markets, except for the large producing countries, are highly competitive to other wines, with all sorts of wines. Therefore, I think you will find that this movement will continue, and the only way France can maintain anything like its current market share is by making better and better wines. France has enormous potential to do this. It has possibly one of the best arguments in terms of natural conditions and know-how of any country in the world. But I think the French producers have collectively, individual, of course, there are exceptions, have become a little lackadaisical in past years about being as good and about communicating. You see, the problem is not just making the wine as well as you can, it's also communicating about it.
Do you get the feeling that France is now lagging behind? There hasn't been enough investment in trying to catch up with the market and adapt to these new tastes?
Well, I think there's a lesson to be learned from...
train professionals as well.
I think there's a lesson to be learned from this training system. You see, there's no equivalent in France. The sommeliers have their schools. There's no schooling, particularly for people who work in shops or supermarkets, unless they go to private courses. So there's no collective trade training. And the other problem with the training that you find is that the training will always, or nearly always, have a bias towards French wines. And if you undertake a course in Bordeaux or in Burgundy, you will learn about Bordeaux wines and Burgundy wines. You won't learn about wine in general, or at least not enough about wine in general. So somebody training in the French market to go and sell French wines abroad will suddenly discover Chile or New Zealand or Australia and won't know what to say about it. Because if you say, oh, well, it's Chilean, that's not sufficient. You have to say, well, what is this wine like? How is it made? Who is it going to please? How can I drink it? How can I talk about it?
But doesn't it go along with the consumers' taste themselves, the market openness here in France? Don't you get the feeling that consumers here in France are way too focused on French wines and not really interested in what's being produced elsewhere?
First of all, they don't see. I think that there's a big generational aspect in this. The young generation who's travelled much more than their parents have are much more open-minded. I see it in courses that I teach myself here in France. Young French people are very open-minded. I serve them wines from all over the world. They have no bias whatsoever towards them. If you just give them the keys to understanding a little bit about it, to be able to read a label, to be able to think about their own tastes and what they're experimenting, and you serve the wines blind, you hide the label so that there's no bias possible, then people will learn very fast. I don't think there's any intrinsic barrier against learning about wine. Anybody can learn about wine. It's a question of structuring the teaching properly.
London's long been the centre of the world's wine trade. It's not the case anymore. You told me before we started this show that Hong Kong is now the
I think
centre.
London still is overall, but Hong Kong has now taken the leadership in, for example, top-level Bordeaux. Burgundy is another matter because this new Chinese market, Hong Kong is a gateway to China. It's a former British colony, so the English have established trading posts there for some time. And now Hong Kong has become the single largest market for auction wines from Bordeaux. The Christie's and Sotheby's, who sell there, and Hong Kong auction houses, have increased their turnover figure enormously over the last few years, and last year, in 2010, were the biggest single market for top Bordeaux.
So we should keep looking at these markets.
Yes.
Thank you.
And we should remember that they also abolished all taxes on wine, so they clearly decided to become a key market for top wines.
And that's a lesson to remember. And with that, we'll wrap up this edition of Beyond Business. Thank you very much, David Cobble, for being with us today on France 24. It's now the end of this show. Thank you all for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.